There's a quiet shift happening in Jewish leadership. More and more women are taking up roles at the top or carving out unique leadership roles of their own creation. On Women's Gallery podcast, Joanne Greenaway, CEO of the London School of Jewish Studies, meets normal women who are also superstar trailblazers. She explores their personal journeys of discovering and growing into their leadership potential in education, community, Jewish law, Torah study, advocacy, healthcare, technology, politics, and more. Joanne's newest episode, episode 42, is an inspiring interview with Rachel Sharansky-Danziger. Together, Joe and Rachel explore how prayer, storytelling, and leadership can create space for understanding and collaboration, even amid deep disagreement. Step into Women's Gallery to hear what happens when women bring their full selves to the center of Jewish life. Follow Women's Gallery on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, or look for a link in the show notes.
When we read the accounts of the Tanakh, of the events of the past, what we need to keep in mind is that the Torah is not a photograph, it's a painting. What do I mean by that? Rav Kook writes about this. He says that the stories in Tanakh might not necessarily be 100% factually told the way that they actually happened. He has no problem saying this. He says that the Torah tells us its accounts, including the Torah itself, not just Tanakh, but the Torah itself, with the purpose of inculcating a message, penetrating our hearts and souls so that we come away with the right inspiration and with the right messages. And he says, if you have a documentary, something, let's say the Shoah, then you have all the facts, but that might not penetrate your heart and soul the same way as a good movie like Schindler's List might. And so Rav Kook says, because the Torah's ultimate purpose is to educate and to inspire and to inculcate lessons, it has no qualms when the dry facts themselves might be just that, a bit dry, to embellish the facts and create a richer narrative that will penetrate the soul. Or as I like to say, when I say that the Torah is not a photograph, it's a painting, nobody ever looked at a Rembrandt and said, nah, people don't glow like this. No, people look at a Rembrandt and they go, wow, he got the soul of man.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. You may notice that my voice is a bit rough today. I'm unfortunately a bit under the weather, so today's introduction will be brief. In fact, I was supposed to record this episode on Thursday, but I asked my guest, Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman, to postpone until Motzei Shabbat, at which point I assumed my voice would be better, but it wasn't. So I postponed again until this morning, Sunday, March 15th. And this morning, my voice was still a mess. But today's release day, so here we are. As it turned out, the Iranians also tried to push it off with an alert going off during our recording, but that we made through just fine. But I'm very excited about this conversation. With Pesach approaching, I had the privilege of speaking with Rabbi Berman of Ilan University about his amazing new Haggadah, Echoes of Egypt. In this episode, we explore why the historicity of the Exodus really matters, how the Torah radically challenged the political and religious assumptions of the ancient world, and how discoveries from Egyptology can illuminate familiar parts of the Haggadah in surprising ways. Rabbi Berman shows how the Torah often takes the symbols of Pharaoh's world and turns them upside down, transforming propaganda about kings and gods into a revolutionary message about God, freedom, and the dignity of ordinary people. It's a very thought-provoking discussion that may change the way you read the Haggadah this year, and we'll get to it in just a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Finally, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman is professor of Tanakh at Bar-Ilan University. A graduate of Princeton University and of Yeshivat Har Etzion, Rabbi Berman is the author of Created Equal: How the Bible Broke with Ancient Political Thought, which was a National Jewish Book Award finalist in scholarship. He is also the author of Inconsistency in the Torah, Ancient Literary Convention and the Limits of Source Criticism, and Ani Ma'amin, Biblical Criticism, Historical Truth, and the 13 Principles of Faith. His articles on biblical theology and contemporary society have appeared in the pages of Mosaic Magazine and the Wall Street Journal. Rabbi Dr. Berman served as member of the International Advisory Board for the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. He is host of the acclaimed new podcast, The Bible Bar. Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman, thank you very much for joining me once again on the Orthodox Conundrum Podcast.
Oh, always a pleasure to be with you, Scott.
We're going to open up with a provocative question today. Could you please tell me and our listeners, why do you believe that the belief that the exodus from Egypt was an actual historical event, why it matters? What I mean by that, if I play devil's advocate, is there not room to say that faith in the God of the Bible, as the redeemer of slaves and redeemer of the oppressed, is more important than any particular historical occurrence?
Oh my goodness. Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. So I have some friends, really, I would say Yirei Shamayim and even Lamdanim, who have said to me, it doesn't really matter to me whether there was actually an exodus or not. I'm a Jew because my father was a Jew and my grandfather was a Jew, and this is what we do, and this is how we relate to the Ribbono Shel Olam, and that's fine for me, and I'm happy that it's fine for them. It's not fine for me, and I'll say why. I believe that the foundational notion that stands behind our relationship with the Ribbono Shel Olam is Hakaras Hatov, giving thanks, giving proper appreciation for the act of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And I derive this from the Aseres HaDibros, from the Ten Commandments, that the way in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu opens up, he does not say, I am the Lord who created you, or who created the world. It's Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim beit avadim. I took you. And there are things that are very distinct about this redemption. And therefore, because it happened to us, and it couldn't have happened without a Kadosh Baruch Hu, that is the whole basis for our obligation to him.
Okay, that's a very important answer. Let's talk about memory, though, because it's not just that we believe this was an historical occurrence. The entire Haggadah is predicated upon the idea that this is something that happened to us, the idea of memory. So what do you think the connection is between understanding history and treating it as a memory, as something that's personal that happened to us?
Well, I don't know if this is precisely what you mean, but I think that there's the event, and then there's how we're meant to remember it and process it. I think all of us in our own lives can, if we're old enough, as you and I are old enough, you kind of apprehend and think about events earlier in your life in different ways as you go on in your life, and you understand their significance. You might understand parents who have departed in one way at one time in life, and then another way another time in life. And so there's a kind of ongoing process of processing what has happened to us in the past, and maybe that comes through in the various accretions that, as we know, the Haggadah is. There is no more living document in our Masorah than the Haggadah, which constantly has things added to it. I think that what's so important here is, it's an idea that I like to teach about, is that when we read the accounts of the Tanakh, of the events of the past, what we need to keep in mind is that the Torah is not a photograph, it's a painting. It's not a photograph, it's a painting. What do I mean by that? Rav Kook writes about this. He says that the stories in Tanakh might not necessarily be 100% factually told the way that they actually happened. He has no problem saying this. He says that the Torah tells us its accounts, including the Torah itself, not just Tanakh, but the Torah itself, with the purpose of inculcating a message, penetrating our hearts and souls so that we come away with the right inspiration and with the right messages. And he says, I'm paraphrasing to speak in our language, because his language is incredibly flowery. If you have a documentation of something, a documentary, of something, let's say the Shoah, then you have all the facts, but that might not penetrate your heart and soul the same way as a good movie like Schindler's List might. And so Rav Kook says because the Torah's ultimate purpose is to educate and to inspire and to inculcate lessons, it has no qualms when the dry facts themselves might be just that, a bit dry, to embellish the facts and create a richer narrative that will penetrate the soul. Or as I like to say, when I say that the Torah is not a photograph, it's a painting, nobody ever looked at a Rembrandt and said, nah, people don't glow like this. No, people look at a Rembrandt and they go, wow, he got the soul of man.
Very interesting. So I'm actually getting ahead of myself now, but I'm going to ask this question, which I was reserving it for later. But for example, I'm going to mention something that Rabbi Berman, you've said. You say that the description of the victory of Ramses the Great over the Hittites at Kadesh, apparently we have 10 distinct copies of that. That inspired the way that the Torah describes God's victory over Pharaoh and the Egyptians. So are you saying that the story didn't exactly happen in the same way, but the Torah wrote it in a different way that's somewhat similar in order to connect it to that victory over the Hittites?
So there's two ways to say it. Let me just back up a little bit because not everybody has read the Haggadah that I put out the way that you have, Scott. But okay, let's back up a little bit. So a lot of scholars believe that the Exodus took place around the time of Ramses II, otherwise known as Ramses the Great, and he was great. He reigned longer than any pharaoh and had more victories than any other pharaoh and expanded the borders perhaps more than any other pharaoh. So he was Ramses the Great. His greatest achievement, his greatest victory, was at a big battle over his arch nemesis, the Hittite Empire in modern-day Anatolia, Turkey. And this was a huge battle at a place called Kadesh, having nothing to do with Kadesh in the Tanakh, a place on the modern-day border between Syria and Lebanon. And from the descriptions, both the Egyptian and Hittite inscriptions, the scholars think that this might have been the largest chariot battle of all time. What's more important for my purposes is that when Ramses comes back to Egypt, he plasters Egypt with accounts of this. He makes it what is ultimately the most publicized event in ancient history. By that I mean, just by way of comparison, think of Titus. Titus sacks Jerusalem in 70, and he goes back to Rome and he builds the Arch of Titus. Many of us perhaps have visited there. One arch of Titus, one. But Ramses goes back home after the Battle of Kadesh, and as you mentioned, puts it up in what we know are at least 10 different places. Accounts, pictures, bas reliefs, sometimes several accounts of the battle. Some of these are in papyrus that were apparently read out to servants and slaves. So this was the most publicized event in all of ancient history. Now, my claim is that when you read the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim itself, like once Bnei Israel are out, I'm speaking of Exodus 14 and 15, Perek Yudaled, Tedvav, where they go out, where they are chased by the chariots, where Hashem splits the seas, etc., and the Bnei Israel go through and they go to Shirat Hayam. When you read those two chapters together, and you read the Kaddish poem of Ramses II, where he describes the kind of the progression of the battle with the Hittites, it's remarkable because there's one-by-one correspondence in the unfolding of the battle. Maybe the most remarkable part of it is that in both what we have in Chumash and what we have in the Kaddish poem, the protagonist army, that means in our story, Bnei Israel. Bnei Israel, when they see the chariots that were chasing them, they go to pieces. They're totally behelim, as we say here, shocked. And the same thing happens to Ramses' troops when the Hittites come on their chariots and they all run away. And then it says that Ramses' troops came back and they saw all the corpses of the Hittites and they saw the great hand of Ramses and they had faith in him and they were awed by him, right? Just like we have at the end of Shemot Yudalid, right? Vayar b'nei Yisrael v'nitzayim met al sfat hayam, right? They saw the corpses at the edge of the sea and they saw Yad Hashem and they had great awe in him. And then the next thing that happens in the Kaddish poem is that Ramses' troops sing a shira to him. They give a big paean, a hymn of praise to him. And they say things like, you destroy your enemies like the chaff. And who is like you, the great warrior? And then it describes how he marched them back to Egypt and arrived triumphantly in his castle, in his palace, where the gods gave him eternal rule. And this is what we have in Shirat Hayam, that we say similar things, Yochalenu Kakash, and your right hands shattered them. There's several others that I'm skipping over here. And Shirat Hayam is not only about Kriyas Yamsuf. Shirat Hayam then looks forward to Hashem leading his troops triumphantly into Eretz Yisrael, into Mikdash Hashem Konur Yadecha, his, as it were, palace, and he's given eternal rule. Hashem Yimloch Le'olam Va'ed. Okay, so you look at this. To my mind, it's unmistakable, and the question is: so what to make of it? What to make of it? So I think that this is part of a kind of strategy that we see in many aspects of the Torah's telling of the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of what we would call cultural appropriation. That is, you take the Pharaoh's royal propaganda and invert it to use against them. So if this was, the story, the accounts, the pictures, the bas reliefs that were being used to indoctrinate Egyptians of all levels of society about the greatness of the greatest Pharaoh and his greatest achievement of all of Egyptian history, then along comes the Torah and says, you want to understand the Ribbon Shalom? So it's just like that, but now it's the Ribbon Shalom in the place of Ramses II. So now to your question, it could be, I think I can say this in two ways, okay? I can say, no, really, the story of Kriyat Yamsuf took place exactly, Kichtavo v'chil shono, exactly as it's written in Chumash, and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu planned it out that way in order for Bnei Yisrael living through it would be able to see, this is like what we learned in Egyptian kindergarten about how great Ramses II was. Or it could be that, I don't know exactly what happened there. As we all know, even great figures like Rav Soloveitchik and Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, all kind of tried to minimize the miraculous aspect of what was going on. Maybe they were a little uncomfortable with that. Whatever the reality was, the way in which the Torah has scripted that reality, has sculpted it for our ultimate consumption, for our memory, is in a way that very much resembles the Kaddish poem of Ramses II. And maybe here, this goes back to what I was saying, the painting that the Ribbon Shalom wants us to keep in mind about this event, not necessarily the photograph, but the painting, the telling of it, is a telling that would remind Bnei Israel and generations thereafter, at least the first couple of generations, of this seminal event and seminal composition within Egyptian history that used to be used to describe the greatest achievement of the greatest Pharaoh, is now used to describe the greatest accomplishment of the Melech Malachei HaMalachim.
So your answer really is, it could be either one. It could be that Hashem orchestrated the events to parallel them or wrote them that way.
I wasn't there. Yeah.
Okay. Now, when you say that at least for the first few generations they would understand that reminds me of something that I once heard from Professor David Schatz in New York. He described in an article different approaches to explaining the first parak of Breshit, the creation story, using modern discoveries of physics. And he said in that case that there's something called bold concordism, that's what he titles it, which is associated with certain professors, like, for example, Gerald Schroeder and Nathan Aviezer, where they say that recent advances in physics can help us understand what Breshit was saying all along. Now, there's nothing wrong with this approach, and if people like it and it works for them, that's great. However, other people don't like this approach, and one of the regular objections is that it seems strange to them that God would hide the real meaning of these psukim for 3,000 years, and only in the 20th and 21st century do we understand what God was saying all along. Now, I'm going to reverse that with what you just said. When we bring Egyptology into play, we have sort of the reverse question, because it's not that it takes 3,000 years to understand it. It's the other way around. It's that you only understood what it really meant, that symbolism of Ramses and the Hittites and showing the parallelism, if you were alive at the time, and a couple of generations later, people who had no access to that Egyptian history wouldn't know what it was talking about, unless nowadays you're an Egyptologist or a biblical scholar. So my question really is, how do we relate to the notion that there are ideas in the Torah that we can only grasp if you were either alive at the time or soon thereafter, or if you have a degree in Egyptology?
Right. That's an excellent question. And sometimes the way that it's phrase to me is, Rabbi, isn't the Torah eternal? And if it's eternal, then how can it be speaking in any register that was only available, as you say, to either those who lived through it or those who've studied it, with academic degrees? And that's really troubling because we believe that our Torah is eternal. So the first thing that I want to say is that I didn't make this stuff up. The Rambam made up this approach. The Rambam, not only as a religious thinker, but I would say even as a scholar, he is the first figure in history, to the best of my knowledge, who looks at the Torah and says, wait a minute, I got to get in touch with what was going on at the time. The more I know about the ancient reality of the world, the better I will understand the Torah. And the Rambam does this many times in the third section of the Moreh Nevuchim, when he is giving the reasons for the mitzvot, and especially when he comes to aspects of the avoda, the cultic aspects, sacrifice, tabernacle, things like that. The Rambam, on many occasions, defers to what he has discovered about ancient idol worship practices that he studied, and he says he bemoans. He says in one of his letters, I made an effort to get every book in the world that I could about the ancient world. And he says at the end of Moreh Nevuchim, halavai that I would have more knowledge of the ancient world, because the more that I know about the ancient world, the better I understand Chumash. This is what he says. So he had no problem with this, but that just kicks the can down the road. Okay, so there's apparently a precedent, even a strong precedent within the Masorah to do this. But da'aka, as they say. So okay, but what about the issue itself? How can it be that the Torah speaks in a way that is going to be largely indecipherable, or totally, readers of the Torah will just not get it unless they were there, or unless they're here listening to this podcast, for all intents and purposes. So my answer to that, and I think this is what the Rambam would have answered, is that the Torah is eternal and its messages and ideas are eternal. But that does not necessarily mean that every jot and tittle in the entire Tanakh is going to be immediately accessible by all members of Klal Yisrael across all ages. In fact, that's virtually impossible. Not because of a limitation on the Ribbono Shel Olam, but because of our own limitations as human beings. We are born in time and place, and we're born in different times and in different places, and therefore our ways of thinking, our aesthetics change over time, and so therefore we hope that the Torah's great messages will radiate or will resonate, that's the better word, sometimes from this passage, sometimes from that passage, and that the main ideas overall will successfully be communicated over time. In fact, if precisely because we maintained the Torah is eternal, it makes sense that there will be certain passages that resonate more strongly at this time and this place with these readers, listeners, and other passages that will resonate more strongly at other times, at other places with other listeners.
In that case, let me ask you sort of a follow-up question or a parallel question. What would you say one should do with the midrashic or Torah Sheba'al Peh understandings of what happened at Yetziat Mitzrayim, which might not necessarily work with what you're saying, but in fact even contradict them and say something quite different? What do you do with those particular passages, for example, in the Midrash?
So Midrash or Kabbalah, look, there are Shivim Panim LaTorah, and I'm staking out one. All I want is one of the Shivim Panim. I find generally that people that have a Kabbalistic orientation to how they read Chumash don't know what to do with what I'm doing. I can understand that. It's very, if you say the reality that's in this text is explained exclusively by the Kabbalah, then you don't really have a place to take someone who says, well, maybe there's realities that are better explained with reference to ancient Egyptian texts. And what I like to say is I don't like to diss or to disqualify or rule out other readings. I really believe there's Shivim Panim LaTorah, and there's many radio stations, and they play many types of music, and we have many types of music within our Masorah. We have 70 types of music, and I'm kind of playing fiddle on one of them. That's all.
That sounds good to me. So I'd like to ask you some more specific questions about what you talk about. In fact, I'm now going to quote something you said in one of your introductions in the Haggadah. You have a couple of them. And you wrote that against this viewpoint, meaning the common viewpoint of the ancient world, You write, the Torah takes a completely different position, which rests upon two far-reaching theological innovations. First, it presents a model of heavenly sovereignty, which strips earthly power structures of their sacral legitimacy. Second, it provides ideological grounding for the existence of a homogeneous nation of common ennobled citizens. I'd like you to expand upon that and explain what you mean by that and what kind of power structures is the Torah talking about, and how did the Torah break with this viewpoint?
Yeah, so all the texts that are created in the ancient world that have come down to us, they're really all about the powerful. All historical texts are always first-person autobiographical accounts by the kings themselves. I went out to battle. I did this. There's never third person. It's all about the kings, especially in Egypt. The Code of Hammurabi is all about protecting the rich. Interest rates in the Code of Hammurabi are 33% a year. And so it was always the rich, and it was always especially the powerful, meaning kings and temples, which all go together in the ancient world, were the entire focus of the civilization. And the Torah is the first blueprint for a society that takes away a lot of the power of kings and also a lot of the power of priests. I'll talk about that in a second, and gives much more status and economic and political security to the common people. When I say it takes away status from the priests, we have the old joke, my father was a Kohen, my grandfather was a Kohen, I want to be a Kohen. The truth is, if you wanted to be a priest in the ancient world, you were looking around, well, let's see, in which culture do I want to be a priest? Where would I get the best deal? The answer is you get the worst deal in Israel, because elsewhere, the temples were enormous and the storehouses were enormous. And if you were a priest, you were sitting on huge amounts of economic surplus. And in the Torah, there's relatively few sacrifices, and you don't get to own land if you're a Kohen. Everyone else gets to own land, you don't. So this is also a way in which the types of economic power that priests had in the ancient world are stripped down in the Torah. Just to give you a sense of the economic clout that some of these priests had, there's one temple that when I took groups to Egypt, we visit one temple which is surrounded by arei miskenot, storehouses, exactly what the Torah says that the Bnei Israel built. And the storehouses cover the size of 15 football fields, and they surround the temple. It's huge, right? So this is part of what the Torah is doing to kind of take away economic resources from the priests and from the temple and leaving it in the hands of the common people.
In fact, I know in the Torah itself, at the end of Parshat Vayigash, that's very clear when Yosef basically buys everybody in Mitzrayim in their land except for the priests. The Torah makes that very clear. The priests, you don't touch the priests.
Right. Right. That's right.
I have to say that one of the ideas that most moved me in reading your Haggadah is when you talk about some of the unexpected aspects of the Torah's miracles. For example, you talk about the big surprise of splitting the sea, given what was known in the ancient world, is not so much that God split the sea. Gods can do big things like that, but it's that slaves are the ones who are being freed. And similarly, you say that the big shock of the Epiphany at Har Sinai was not so much that God spoke from a fire, that's fine, but it's that he spoke to everybody. The common people received the revelation along with Moshe Rabbeinu.
That's right. Yeah. And I mean, you can see this very vividly. I'm sure many of us have seen pictures of temples in Egypt where there's these enormous statues of the Pharaoh that built the temple out front. And I guess many of us would look at, these, I mean, some of these statues are like 70 yards high, really big. And we would say, well, why is there a big statue of the Pharaoh that built this temple? And we might think, well, it's simply because he's, instead of a donor plaque, we have a donor statue. Sometimes some people have a plaque. Some donors have even a bust, in the lobby of the museum or the hospital or whatever it is. Okay, so the pharaohs took it 100 steps further and they built enormous statues of themselves because they were the ones that built the temple. It isn't just that. They did build the temple, but it's because when you go inside these temples and you look on the walls, everything is about the relationship between that pharaoh and the various gods. He is the focus. And along comes the Torah and has no role for the king inside the Mikdash. And it says, V'shachanti betocham, right? Hashem is within the people. And then in Sefer Devarim, it will say, Usmachtem lifnei Hashem Elokechem. This is the Beit HaMikdash is a place where we rejoice with the Ribono Shel Olam. We, you and me, all the simple people of Klal Yisrael. The connection is between God and the people.
Can you expand upon that a little bit? You mentioned that the Torah was fundamentally challenging this idea that kings are divine or semi-divine. In the ancient world, what did that look like? What did people think the kings really were? Like, did they actually believe that the kings were divine?
Interesting. Yeah. So I don't think that in Egypt, for the most part, scholars debate this to this day. They certainly believed that the kings were chosen by the gods, that the kings sometimes were given powers that maybe other humans don't have. One of my favorite images anywhere in Egypt, this isn't in the Haggadah. So there's this enormous temple in southern Egypt, built by Ramses II, Ramses the Great. And inside, as I mentioned, he has endless pictures of him giving incense to this god and that god, and an offering to this god or that god, getting a blessing from this god and that god. There's 39 gods that he has different relationships with. There's more gods in ancient Egypt than anywhere else. My favorite god, can I tell you what my favorite god is, Scott, in ancient Egypt? It's a picture where Ramses II is worshiping Ramses II. There's a god, Ramses II. You know, if you thought your boss worships himself, this takes it one step further. I can't even wrap my head around that. Like, what does it even mean, the god Ramses II? Okay. So yeah, so there's some of that too. I don't remember how we got to that, but
Well, just the idea that kings are divine. Do they actually believe that? Do the common people believe that?
Yeah, no. So I think that they believe that they had, divine inspirations, some divine powers. Let's leave it at that. It's there's different sources that kind of resonate different ways on that one.
Okay. I'd like to ask you what you mean by the vassal treaty. You say that the revelation at Har Sinai is anchored in that idea, the vassal treaty. What is that exactly? And what is the Torah trying to teach by doing the same thing with God and Israel?
Right. Yeah, this is a really important point. So Ma'amad Har Sinai depicts for us a relationship that's hard to pin down. In that, is this something that Bnei Israel join freely? Well, on the one hand, of course, they say Na'aseh v'nishma. It sounds like it was presented to them and they had to accept it. On the other hand, I think that even when we're reading Jes Chumash, even before we get to the Medrash, you kind of get the sense that the famous midrash that HaKadosh Baruch Hu held Har Sinai over Bnei Israel, Har Kigigit, as like he was as a great weight that he was ready to just let go on top of them if they didn't say yes, also seems to be true. So what's going on here? And I think that there's we now know that there are many aspects of the relationship between Hashem and Am Yisrael, many mitzvot that become illuminated when we get in touch with what's known as the ancient Near Eastern vassal treaty. What does that mean? What would happen in the ancient world would be the following. You would have a king of some size who would suddenly find himself in dire straits. Either he's under siege from another king, or there's been a famine or a plague, and he desperately needs the help of a stronger power. And so he sends out an SOS to a stronger power, and that stronger king sends along troops or food or whatever it is that is necessary to bring salvation to this weaker king. When that would happen, it was understood by all parties that it was incumbent upon the weaker king who had received salvation to become a vassal to the sovereign, the stronger king. To be a vassal king does not mean to be enslaved. You do not lose your autonomy, but you become, to put it in our parlance, a kind of junior partner to that senior partner, that stronger king. And that stronger king would then dictate the terms of the relationship now between the two parties. The senior king, or what we call the sovereign king, would say, okay, you have to pay me taxes X, Y, and Z. You have to send me soldiers X, Y, and Z. You have to be loyal exclusively to me. You cannot make treaties with anybody else. And that this becomes the template for the relationship between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Am Yisrael. That is, Am Yisrael, after Yetziat Mitzrayim, where it says in Perek Bet, Vatal Shavatam El Elokim Mina Avodah, their angst, their cries went out and they went up to the Ribono Shel Olam. from the slavery, that's Bnei Yisrael calling out, and then the sovereign king, Kadosh Baruch Hu, delivers Am Yisrael. And now what's understood by all parties is that now there needs to be a treaty between the stronger sovereign king, the weaker vassal king, to now kind of set into stone what will be the terms of the relationship between this stronger and junior partners. But that's the main thing. They are partners, but they are unequal. So what I find so remarkable about this is that it raises Am Yisrael to be the level of a king, not in parity, not the same as the Melech Malchei HaMelachim, but we are a kingdom. We are a Mamlechet Kohanim. And then we have this relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu that expresses itself through the tribute that we give him, which is the Shmirat HaMitzvot. And there are just many, many mitzvot that we have that they're illuminated by this. I'll just give like one example. In these treaties, routinely the sovereign king says, "Oh, and you, vassal king, you shall come and appear in my court periodically to come and greet me." Well, this is what we have in Aliyat Regel. That every so often we have to go to the court of the sovereign king, or where the sovereign king will say to the vassal king, "You must periodically review and hear read out to you the stipulations of this treaty." Well, this is what we have at Hakel, that every so often we have to go hear all of this read to us again, and many other things that are resonant with that.
That's also interesting. It explains so much. I'm now going to ask you a question which may be unanswerable, but I'll ask it anyway. You're talking now about what you called the dynamics of appropriation. And why do you think it's better, quote unquote, for the Torah to have used, or for God to have used, appropriating symbols that people already knew, rather than to create something brand new? I would almost think that the vassal treaty or any other appropriation that the Torah is using, it might have been understandable to the people at the time. We already talked about why the Torah might have done that. But at the same time, could not, so to speak, God have created a brand new idea that's even better, that might not have used something which was obviously not perfect in its own time? Why wouldn't God have created brand new symbols that would be more eternally valid?
Right. So I think that actually what was happening in the Torah is a mix of the two. That is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu realizes, this is what the Rambam writes explicitly in Moreh Nevuchim, that Hashem has to speak to the people in the world they live in. And at the same time, the whole idea of the Torah is to raise Am Yisrael and to raise the spiritual world that they are inhabiting above that which they are leaving behind. And I think that this is what we see throughout the Torah. You can see a kind of, I would say, adopting but adapting things that Hashem takes from the other cultures to bring Am Yisrael upward and onward.
I've used these examples before, but in some ways, Lahavdil, it reminds me a bit of Sgt. Pepper by the Beatles or Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. Those are two albums that appeared, one in 67, one in 66, that radically changed pop music. And if somebody listens to them today, they often don't know why they were so great, because they sound wonderful, but nothing special. And the answer is because you can't put yourself back into that time and understand how different they sounded from everything that came beforehand. In some ways, again, Lahavdil, I think the Torah did the same thing, that we look at the Torah now and some of the amazing innovations about democracy, about the importance of common people, about de-emphasizing kings and so on and so forth. And people look at that and don't even notice them because the Torah has been so successful. In that sense, the Torah is a victim of its own success. We don't see those innovations anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Now, I'd like to go through some specific examples. Before we went on the air, you said you wanted to give a few or four examples about how this works together. It could be some of them we've already mentioned, but maybe you can give some more examples of looking at Egyptology and the history of ancient Egypt to illuminate ideas in the Haggadah.
Right. Okay. So let's start with just something that, I'm sure we're all familiar with on a basic level. And at the Haggadah, in the Haggadah, we say, based on Sefer Devarim, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu took us out of Egypt, biyad chazaka uvizruah netuyah, with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. So it's interesting when you look in the Tanakh that the use of that phrase, mighty hand and outstretched arm, that it really only appears with reference to the events of Yetziat Mitzrayim. When we look elsewhere in Tanakh, we do not find that this phrase, Yad Chazakah B'Zruah Netuyah, is described other than with regard to the events of the Exodus. There'll be a phrase, Yad Hashem. It turns out that this phrase, mighty hand and outstretched arm, has a provenance, and that is that when you look at the inscriptions of the pharaohs themselves, during the period at which Bnei Israel were residing in Egypt. Let's say roughly 1500 to 1200 BCE, give or take a century here or there. But during that period, everything the pharaohs do is with their mighty hand and an outstretched arm. The pharaoh defeated the Libyans, his enemies to the west, with a mighty hand. One day, the pharaoh was walking and discovered at his feet a diamond the size of his fist, which he lifted with his outstretched arm. And on, hundreds and hundreds of times there's a reference to this. So here is an example of cultural appropriation, that in order to depict just how great HaKadosh Baruch Hu was and how weak the Egyptians were, or vulnerable the pharaohs were, here we are using their own terms in kind of a spiritual warfare to describe HaKadosh Baruch Hu's greatness. So that's a nice idea. Now, if you didn't have the degree in Egyptology, or if you didn't listen to this podcast or read Berman's Haggadah, you'd still pretty much get the idea of Yad Chazaka V'Zrua Netuyah. So I'm adding a little bit. It's nice. It's a nice idea, but okay. You could live without it. Jews understood this phrase forever without any of this Egyptological stuff. Let's take another example that I think is a little bit more illuminating. So Hashem says, or Moshe Rabbeinu says, in Sefer Devarim, that at Har Sinai, Panim el panim diber Hashem imachem, that Hashem spoke to us face to face. That's a very strange phrase, because just a few weeks ago we read in Parashat Kitisa, Lo yir'ani ha'adam v'chai, that we're not able to see the Ribono Shel Olam. So how could it be that he spoke to us face to face? We stood there with blindfolds on? What does it mean, panim el panim? So when you look, it's actually the cover of the Haggadah and several images that I have inside. All over Egypt, you see the following thing. Whenever the pharaohs and the gods are depicted together, they are exactly the same size. The gods are in fully human form, human size. In fact, you sometimes look at a picture of a god and a pharaoh, and you can't really tell which is the god and which is the pharaoh. They're often like standing literally face to face. And sometimes you can even see, and I have pictures of this in the Haggadah, where the god has his arms around the pharaoh's waist and is pulling him towards him. It has erotic overtones, and they look like they're about to kiss. I mean, they're just that parallel and that close. And what these images are meant to describe is just how beloved the pharaohs were to the gods. And they wanted to broadcast this in visual form to everybody. So along comes the Torah and says, forget about the pharaohs. Panim el panim diber Hashem imachem, face to face. It isn't that we were able to see the Ribono Shel Olam at Har Sinai, because obviously we couldn't. There's an Arnan, there's a cloud, there's fire and all that. But the sense that we are now the chosen ones and not the leaders and not the powerful, that's a beautiful idea. And I think that it has an exegetical payoff, because now I understand how one pasuk says, Lo yirani ha'adam v'chai, you can't see me and live. And another pasuk says that God spoke to us face to face. It's this cultural appropriation. So I think that the payoff there is better. Let me take something that I think conceptually is really cool. As I mentioned earlier, the Egyptians had a lot of gods, and they were very religious people. And they had lots of holidays. But all of the holidays that Egyptians had, and I think this is probably true throughout the ancient world, the festivals that they had were all exclusively agricultural. The plowing season, the harvesting season, the rain season, etc. And this was true in Egypt. There's festivals for the inundation, the Nile comes down and inundates. There's festivals for the harvest season, etc. There are never in the Egyptian calendar holidays that commemorate what any god, this god, that god, any god, what any god did for the Egyptian people. There is no historical event that is commemorated in the Egyptian calendar. So even though they would credit their gods with victories, but it was quickly forgotten. There is no history that Egyptians passed down, the story that they tell themselves about themselves. There's no consciousness of that, and certainly not in relation to how the gods have related to them over time through events of salvation. This is all an invention of the Torah, that God would be involved in the history, that we would want to recall those events, that we have a story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. That's something that appears only in the Torah, and I think that's a huge thing. That's a really huge thing. But then we come to what I think is really the biggest blowaway idea that I've ever come across. Not my own. This is an idea that you have to say b'shem Omro, even if the Omro isn't necessarily Jewish, but he deserves credit for it. A really brilliant Egyptologist with a broad theological mind named Jan Assmann, passed away in the past year or so. And he noted the following. He said, and this is starts with something that we all know. The Egyptians are really into the afterlife. Oh man, those tombs and I mean King Tut's tomb, when they found it, they opened it up, they found inside 5,800 artifacts. That's a lot to take with you to the next world. What does a Jew take to the next world? It's tallis, anything, right? That's what else do you need? A tallis, Well, not everybody even takes tallis, Egyptians believed, Scott, in the afterlife the way you and I believe in tomorrow. Okay, meaning, we're certain, obviously we don't know that there's going to be a tomorrow or what tomorrow will look like, but we certainly live our lives with, really practically certainty that
full consciousness that tomorrow is coming.
Yeah, sure. And our calendars are full of things of what we're going to be doing tomorrow and the next day, etc. So it is with that same certitude that the Egyptian lived with a consciousness of the afterlife. You come to the Tanakh, and Sheol here and there, and as we all know, Chazal had to do somersaults in the air to try to figure out where the source of Olam Haba is. To the extent that they find them, let's put it this way: it just doesn't take the same place in the Tanakh anyway that it does for the Egyptians. The question here is, how does a human being deal with the notion of his own mortality? It's just going to end. It'll be over. What do you do with that? It can be pretty somber and kind of a downer. Yeah. So for the Egyptian,
I'd say so.
Yeah. So for the Egyptian, it was simple. There's tomorrow, just like for you and me. Today's not the last day. There's tomorrow. There's the afterlife, and so that's and they had full consciousness of that, and so that's how they dealt with that. So mortality isn't such a big deal. There's the afterlife. What does the Torah have to say about what happens? I mean, since the Torah is clearly not putting the same emphasis on an afterlife as the Egyptians were, the answer is, it goes back to the previous point that I made, that the Torah does put front and center that there is an eternal bond between Am Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. To the degree that you and I and listeners devote ourselves to the concept of Klal Yisrael and its connection with the Ribono Shel Olam, that is eternal. It is through our progeny, our children, our continuing generations, and their subsequent connection with the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that is how we are eternal. And I think that's a really powerful idea. It means, yes, so it might not be, Josh might not live on, Scott might not live on, or past 120 anyway, but that's not really what it's about, because I'm not really here just for me. And you and each of our listeners are not here really for themselves. We're all really here involved in this discussion, whether we are speaking in it or listening to it, because of our participation with Klal Yisrael. The more that we invest in Klal Yisrael, the more that we devote ourselves to Klal Yisrael, the more that we are eternal. Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," and we say, "I am because we are."
Such a beautiful idea.
Yeah, I'm going to take this to a personal and painful place. I am aware that a couple weeks ago in Riverdale, there was a young lady. Her name was Racheli Wiener, Zichronah Livracha, a young mother who perished from complications in childbirth, giving birth to her third child. I mean, it doesn't get more tragic than that. It's like shocking, really shocking. And, the grief is unimaginable, and nothing can be said to mitigate that grief. But there's another truth that's alongside that, when you consider that she perished bringing into this world the future of Am Yisrael, and her life was devoted to Klal Yisrael the way that you and I are. So that means that alongside the terrible loss, there is also eternity. And to her, I would just say, V'omer lach b'damai chayi, v'omer lach b'damai chayi. And, words of condolence to the Wiener and Deichmann families. But that is something that I have been thinking about, how the Torah gives us eternity because of our involvement with the notion of Klal Yisrael and its eternal connection with the Ribono Shel Olam.
Oh, thank you for mentioning that. I'm really sorry to hear that. And
Yeah.
it's a type of nechama amidst everything else, the terrible tragedy you mentioned.
Yeah.
Let me redirect in a different direction, because you also talk about the connection between the Mishkan and the camp of Ramses. Could you talk about that for a few minutes?
Right. So this goes back to that text that I mentioned before about Ramses' greatest achievement, his victory over the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh. One of the really remarkable things, this is actually what got me onto thinking about this, was the discovery that archaeologists made in the 1930s. And that was the following. They noticed in the temple inscriptions of Ramses II about this event that there were bas reliefs, carvings, comics, if you will, of the event. And you look at all of them and you see that in the Egyptian camp, the military camp, at the center of the camp is Ramses' throne tent, or what we would call in Hebrew his chamal. That's the chamal pikud. This is where he led the battle from. And there's a picture in several different places of what that tent looked like. It had two chambers, and the two chambers in kind of freaky ways resemble the Mishkan. That is, there's two chambers. One has the dimensions of 2 by 1. One has the dimensions of 1 by 1. The 2 by 1 is clearly an outer chamber. That's where servants wait. And then there's the inner chamber where the king, Ramses, is sitting. And although it doesn't depict him sitting, it has his name on what we call a cartouche. It says Ramses II or something like that. And then surrounding that name, Ramses II, you have these winged Horus figures that spread their wings, looking at each other, facing each other with their wings spread towards each other. And it's not hard to see that, wow, that looks an awful lot like Kruvim. And it's clear, there's no question that Kruvim are derived. There's a notion throughout the ancient world that the deities have wings that spread. You don't have to be an Oved Avodah Zarah to say this. Boaz said it to Ruth when he says, "You have come lifros tachak nafav," to take up shelter under his spread wings. Okay? So this is even in Chumash that we have, or in Tanakh that we have this sort of phrase, and it's in a bunch of places in Tanakh. So taking all these things together, outer chamber 2 by 1, inner chamber 1 by 1. In the inner chamber, that is where this king resides, surrounded by this kind of honor guard of figures that spread their wings over him, with the entrance from the east and surrounded by a perimeter fence, just like the Mishkan, in the center of a military camp, which after all is what the Torah, once we get to Sefer Bamidbar, that's what it describes. The Mishkan sits in the middle of the Machaneh, right? Degel Machaneh, the four sides. Okay, so archaeologists in the 30s noticed that this is not only highly similar, but more importantly, highly distinct. What do I mean by that? You don't have any other type of tabernacle, sanctuary, temple shrine anywhere in the ancient Near East that looks at all like the Mishkan. You don't have any throne tent in a military camp in a picture that looks at all like Ramses. So these are similar and distinct. And so archaeologists thought, wow, it could be that what the Torah is doing, because after all, Bnei Yisrael couldn't see God and they couldn't hear God, it makes it kind of hard to relate to him. And there's no statue of God. So what the Torah does, this is part of the cultural appropriation, is that it says, here, look, this is now going to be the shrine, the temple, the mikdash, Mishkan, that Hashem dwells in, and it's going to remind you of all those pictures you saw about Ramses' greatest achievement of the greatest period of all of Egyptian history. And now you will understand that Ramses has been thrown out, and now the Ribono Shel Olam is the Melech Malchei HaMelachim.
Very, very cool. I'll ask one final example, even though obviously there are many, many more. In the plague of Kinim, lice, the magicians of Pharaoh call it Etzba Elokim, the finger of God. You have an interesting ha'ara on that.
Yeah, right. So anybody who reads that immediately recognizes nowhere else in Tanakh do we speak about Etzba Elokim. there are several miracles that the Tanakh says Yad Hashem, the hand, but not the etzba. So why is it that in Kinim we hear about the finger of God? Okay, so in my humble opinion, no, this also is not my original idea. I just get to read wonderful scholarship of people who come up with these ideas. One scholar noted the following: that you see in a number of scenes, especially people who are trying to cross the Nile on a little skiff, like a little canoe type thing. You see the depictions of the people in the little boat. You also see the depictions of the water. And in the water, you see massive crocodiles. And I will tell you, these crocodiles were massive. I know this because I've seen them with my own eyes in the Egyptian Museum. Mummified crocodiles, 19 feet long. Okay, and that's mummified. That means shriveled, right? Okay, 19 feet long. So these were real behemoths, okay? And if you're on a little itty bitty boat, it's a pachad, like how am I going to get to the other side? There's this real fear that, one whip of the tail and we're lunch. And so instead of saying a tefillas haderech that we might do, what they would do is they would try to cast a spell on the water. And you can see them pointing down to the water. They can't point to the crocodile because, as we all know, anybody who's ever been on water, you can't really see into the water so clearly what's down there. You might know more or less what's down there, but you can't really see it. So they're pointing kind of obliquely to the water, not to anything in particular. And then you have in a comic, a bubble above, and they make a kind of a spell in which they say, okay, we're now going to, make the crocodile not attack us or something along those lines, okay? But the key is that the spell happens through their finger. And through the finger and the proper abracadabra, as it were, you control nature. Well, what happens in Kinim? It's not that the Torah says that it was Etz by Elohim. It's the Khartoumim. It's the Egyptian sorcerers who say, oh, this is the finger of God. Sure, the Egyptians are speaking like Egyptians. How do you have control over nature? Through a spell that you impose upon some element in nature through your finger. So this must have been the finger of God.
That's very, very cool. Now, before we conclude, I just want to, and please tell me if I'm correct in this, get rid of two misconceptions based on what we've been talking about. First of all, you say that, sadly, the pyramids in Egypt were not built by the Hebrew slaves. Is that true?
That's fear. I mean, that can't be, but it is. But it happens to be true. Yeah, Josephus wrote that Bnei Israel built the pyramids. I'm not sure where he got that from, but I'm afraid it's not so. The pyramids, they stopped building pyramids even before Bnei Israel landed in Egypt, and the reason was that pyramids. They thought pyramids would be a great idea. Everybody gets to see it. What is a pyramid? A pyramid is a great billboard that says, "Come loot me." Everyone can see it and everyone knows, then everyone tries to get in. And this is why at around 1600 BCE, they moved from pyramids to what we all have heard about, the Valley of the Kings, King Tut's tomb, where now we're doing in the most sanua way. We're going to dig into into hard rock and then cover the entrance. And then hopefully no one will be able to loot it. That didn't work either. So we did not build and the Torah doesn't say anything about pyramids. The Torah says that we built arei miskenot, storehouses, and I have pictures of what these storehouses looked like.
Okay, and the second misconception, even though Ramses the Great is the Pharaoh of the enslavement, he wasn't necessarily the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Is that correct?
So look, just forget about what I said. Just let's look at what Chumash says, okay? Chumash speaks about one Pharaoh in Shmot Perek Aleph who enslaves Bnei Israel, right? And then at the end of Perek Bet, it says that Pharaoh died, right? Which means that the name Pharaoh in the subsequent chapters of Sefer Shmot must be talking about that first Pharaoh's son. Okay, so I think that when we speak about the Pharaoh of Yitzhak, we have to speak about the Pharaoh of the Shibud, the enslavement, which in my humble opinion is Ramses II, and then the Pharaoh of the Exodus, of the Makot, if you will. And that would then mean that it was a pharaoh named Merneptah, and there are several compelling reasons that might explain that as well. And leave that to the introductions.
Okay, so I have two final questions before we end today, Rabbi Berman. My first question is this, and I know this is a very well-known and common question. Given the historic events that took place in Egypt and the fact that so much of what we're talking about is reflected in Egyptian ideas, why, at least as far as I know, is this story not mentioned in Egyptian historiography or Egyptian artifacts?
Right. So we have we have quite a bit from ancient Egypt, and certainly skeptics will say, look, we just don't, something this big, you would expect that it would have some resonance in the literature that's come down to us. So here we need to say a few things. Yes, we have many writings about ancient Egypt. We certainly have more writings that we've dug up from the ground about ancient Egypt than we do about ancient Israel. Obviously we have our Tanakh, but that we haven't dug up, that we have passed down. So we need to know something about these inscriptions, about the things that these ancient Egyptian inscriptions tell us about the past. And the best way for me to illustrate this is with a modern example. Okay, imagine that you have an office and you're looking to fill a position in your office, and you put out a call for people to send in their resumes, and you get this big pile of resumes. And you go through them, you go through 100 resumes, and you say, wow, what a talented bunch. Not a single one of them was ever fired. Now, why might you conclude that? Because you read about their professional history, and not one of them says that they were fired. And that's because when you write a resume, you never write that you were fired, right? You just don't do that. And ancient inscriptions were not there to be historical records. The ancient inscriptions were largely there to impress the gods. Like, hey, deity, look what I've done today. Or, hey, subjects, look what I did today. You don't talk about your failures. So there's never any failures. There's no bad news in ancient Egypt. Okay, that's what it comes down to. So you wouldn't expect, therefore, to be a record of this sort of thing. You wouldn't expect for there to be any mention of Ephraim or Yisrael, because slaves were never referred to by where they came from. Just like in the antebellum South in the United States, you might have had a slur word for the slaves, but you never refer, oh, this is my slave from Cameroon, and this is my slave from Niger. No, they were just all whatever they were called, So and so it was also with slaves in Egypt. Also, we need to remember also that the Torah says that Bnei Israel lived in Eretz Goshen, and we know where Eretz Goshen is, roughly. Eretz Goshen, right, it has pasture land. There's only one area in Egypt that has pasture land, and that's what's called the Nile Delta. It's kind of, if you look on a modern map, basically the area from Cairo north to the Mediterranean coast in a kind of a funnel shape. That whole area where the Nile separates out into tributaries is extremely lush and well irrigated. With the result, there has been constant habitation of that area, which is to say constant taking down of previous structures. So there's nothing left from ancient Egypt in the area that Am Yisrael were residing in. And also the water table has risen. There's almost no papyrus from that area. And so therefore, the area which was inhabited by Am Yisrael at that time, nothing at all is left about anything, not about Israel, not about Egypt, nothing.
And I guess in terms of the first reason you mentioned, that's another way that the Torah breaks with ancient culture, and that it does speak about Israel's failures in a way that we would not find in other cultures.
Yeah.
My final question for you, Rabbi Berman, is this. Given everything we've said today and all the wonderful ideas in the Haggadah, and of course there are many more that you mentioned, when someone sits down at the Seder this year and has your Haggadah, what do you hope they'll experience differently that might perhaps add to what they've done in the past?
Okay, well, certainly if you're listening to this podcast and you can't see it, but the Haggadah is visually sumptuous. It is big, and it has big, beautiful pictures. And the big, beautiful pictures aren't just kind of like to add color, oh, here are pyramids. The pictures themselves are part of the explanation. And I think I would hope that people would come away with, wow, like I can almost feel the reality of what was going on, of what was at stake, of what was being argued over at the time. That's really what I want people to come away with, a sense. Just as maybe it's a new twist on the old saying of Chazal, in every generation, a person has to see themselves as if they came out of Egypt. Now, I suspect that what Chazal really had in mind is that we have to have an appreciation of what it means to be a ben chorin, to be free. Not all of us were born into slavery, but we have to appreciate our freedom. But perhaps also a little bit to I think that the Rambam says this, to understand deeply, what the nature of the oppression was and how great the salvation was. And I think that these materials allow us to gain an insight and a glimpse of what that world was like in a way that we can perhaps understand for ourselves as well.
Amazing and beautiful. Rabbi Berman, as a bonus for our paid subscribers to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary, I want to ask you about the ways that you would suggest that someone teach these ideas in high school. Of course, we want to teach them our Masorah in the classic way, and we also may want to teach them some of these more innovative ideas, which I guess in some ways are not so innovative, they're ancient. But how would you balance that if you were creating some sort of high school curriculum? What would you do? To hear Rabbi Berman's fascinating answer to this question, as well as to receive this episode ad-free and with early release, make sure to become a paid subscriber to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. The link is in the description of this podcast. One final question before we go. I want to ask you about your wonderful new podcast.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I just launched a podcast. It's called The Bible Bar. It's the podcast of the Bible department of Bar Ilan University. And its format is kind of like the program 929, which some of our listeners might be familiar with. Each week, we go through another chapter, not a parsha, but a chapter in Tanakh. We started with Bereshit Perek Aleph. Second week was Bereshit Perek Bet. And in 20 years, in Yirtzeh Hashem, we'll finish the entire Tanakh. But every week, what I do is I have on another scholar, sometimes colleagues of mine from Bar Ilan, sometimes scholars from around the world, Jews and non-Jews. And the basic goal of the podcast is to show how biblical scholarship can be interesting and meaningful for all. So check us out at the Bible Bar.
Fantastic. It's always a pleasure speaking with you, Rabbi Berman. I'm so grateful that you came on the podcast today.
Thank you, Scott. And for all of Klal Yisrael, we should know B'sorot Tovot and a Chag Kasher V'Sameach.
I'd like to offer a word of thanks to our Patreon supporters. Patreon functions as a voluntary tip jar for Jewish Coffee House and our family of podcasts. Patreon supporters at all levels, as well as paid subscribers to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary, will have access to our upcoming private Q&A sessions. Your support in either place helps sustain thoughtful Jewish conversation. Additional bonus material, including the longer episodes with bonus questions, is available to paid subscribers of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack. No matter how you choose to support this work, we are deeply grateful. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum Podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum Podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.